So hello everyone, and welcome to the fifth conversation of the Minor Universality project. Today it is our pleasure to talk with the socio-cultural anthropologist Arjun Appadurai, whom I welcome most cordially. Good afternoon, Arjun. You are one of the outstanding cultural theorists of our present and amongst the most prominent personalities when it comes to the analysis of objects, cultural flows, and social forms in a globalized world. So we are very honored to have a conversation with you on questions that arise from our reflections on how universality could or can be thought in a globalized world, in which so many people, objects, concepts, and forces are entangled, and yet borders of any sort fundamentally challenge the idea of a shared humanity. So please allow me, as it has become our custom, to briefly introduce you. You hold a PhD in social thought from the University of Chicago, and you've held professorships in many leading universities of the United States, starting in Chicago and leading towards New York. Whilst you still are professor of media, culture, and communication at NYU Steinhardt, you have also been appointed since this year as the Max Weber Global Professor at Bard College Berlin, an institution that plays a visible role for the internationalization of research, but also of public life, I would say, in Germany. Concerning your lifescape, to make a somewhat ironic wink to one of your key concepts, you grew up in Mumbai, you've made your international career mainly in the United States, and you are, since quite some time now, a Berliner. Even though you have published on a wide range of topics, your works have had a particularly significant impact on the cultural, socio-anthropological, and political reflection of what globalization is and what it means for the understanding of the world we live in. So please allow me to mention just 3 of your books, which are pertinent for our own thinking. Firstly, for me, there is your edited volume, The Social Life of Things, which came out in 1986 and is still today a classic of anthropological scholarship, which illuminated the complex mechanisms behind how value and meaning are assigned to objects. This book still has a great influence now thinking about actors, human-object relationships, and also about the construction of social worlds and interactions. But if I may say so, it is of renewed interest in the critical study of provenance, object biographies, and discussions of material culture, capitalism, and heritage today. Secondly, your seminal book, Modernity at Large, Cultural Dimensions of Globalization, published in 1996, showed how the imagination works as a social force in today's world, providing new resources for identity and energies in creating alternatives to the nation state, whose era you described as coming to an end in a certain way by underlining the major forces of mass migration and electronic mediation in our epoch of globalization. And thirdly, just to pick among your publications, your many publications, I would like to mention The Future as a Cultural Effect, essays on the global condition published with Verso in 2013, in which you reclaim the importance for the social sciences to develop understandings of the future that can cope with the necessities of the world we live in today. Within this book, you also developed the very influential concept of a cosmopolitanism from below, which can be understood as an ethics of living together in a plural world arising from such difficult life circumstances as the slums of Mumbai. A notion, by the way, that has been highly important for development our concept, Minor Universality. So after this admittedly brief and always incomplete overview of your work and lifescape, let me begin our conversation with a question. Is the idea of a global life and consciousness just an illusion of a small privileged class to which, as scholars, we might belong? Or to put it in more structural terms, If identity politics was long a means of post-colonial critique and action, how do we deal with it under these circumstances? If cultural relativism is what populist movements claim all over the world now, isn't it necessary to relaunch an emancipatory discourse on what links us today?
Well, thank you very much, Marcus, and also to Jonas and to the colleagues who have spoken and introduced themselves for this happily small-scale conversation in this day of booming scale and speed and frequency of such events. It's very good to have a conversation that is not only, I hope, in depth, but also in some sense intimate or close enough that we can talk to each other in the ways that we used to and perhaps will one day do again. So I'm very grateful. Launching into your question, it's of course a large one, but right away I will say that what it points to for me is another question, which is whether globalization and its ethos or its value basis is in the end different from, compatible with, contradictory to those of universalism. Because both have to do with something small becoming something big. So ideas or ethics or so on becoming somehow applicable to all, that's universalism. And globalization more at the level of action. So I'm thinking in a way of my intellectual heroine, Hannah Arendt, and vita activa and vita contemplativa. So I'm thinking these two things are like that. So universalism is a kind of contemplative thing, but it shares something with the action which is involved in globalization, because ION means somebody is doing something. So I respond initially by just saying that to me is a way to enter into the question of what is shared or shareable in a situation where we have a kind of contradiction, which is on the one hand, more connectivity than ever before, and on the other hand, more parochialism than ever before. So many people have talked about this problem, but it's a hard one to solve because both things are real. We can act like one of them is unreal, then life becomes easy. But if both are real, then the question of what universalism can mean, whether it should always be plural, in other words, universalism, so that some can be minor, some can be major. But of course, there would be, thinkers of many centuries of great stature who'd say, well, no, but you already made a mistake. Universalism can only be one. Already in saying it can be 2, 3, or 5, you've lost it, So anyway, I'm wandering off, but these are just some starting points into a very large question you're opening about the parochial, shall we say, in contrast to the universal, but perhaps differently in contrast to the cosmopolitan, which you also mentioned. These may be slightly different, and teasing out that difference may be fruitful for us.
Thank you. I would like to continue with a question concerning your biography. In your article, Knowledge, Circulation and Collective Biography, published in French in 2000 in the journal L'Homme, you describe your own intellectual biography in terms of what you call interactive biographies, that is, by describing the interactions with other thinkers and colleagues who have crossed your path. You have worked in particular on the concept of transnational, which seems to characterize your own experience as an expatriate researcher working in transnational institutions of knowledge production. I would therefore like to ask you, what role has this aspect of your biography, the fact of navigating between different academic traditions and cultures, Indian, American, played in the formation of your thoughts?
As they say in France, merci beaucoup. So especially merci beaucoup for remembering this publication, which was part of a collection done by Véronique Benet and Jackie Assayag, who were good friends, both of whom have serious interest in India, but also in other things. And it was a very interesting venture, and it does require for me to comment that when I look back, as I sometimes have to do at my CV and this article, that article, I realize that there are huge parts of it that are only known to some people, that people have no idea that maybe there was this article or like this one, which was, I took it very seriously, and I took that collection in long very seriously. And for a long, it was a very important collection, long, long before even the idea of postcolonialism became a contested idea between my friend Achille Mbembe and my other friend Jean-François Bayard and so on. That's recent, but this already was very early, trying to open up some general things. So I'm grateful for you bringing that up. And I would just say that, the truth is my journey has, of course, some unique or special qualities, not just in the fact of my name and birth and personal history, but structurally. For example, I was very early among the people who went to the United States rather than to England, from India. And that had all sorts of other path dependency effects. Once you go to the US, then, it's a very big place. So you're not like in Oxford or Cambridge or LSE or here and there, where the Association for Social Anthropology, as Jonas knows, is maybe 300 people. Maybe today it's 500. You go to the anthropology meeting in the USA, 3,000 people, half of whom are from other planets you've never seen. It's a different scene, and it was already different then. So, of course, there are things like that which make my journey a bit special, but I want to focus on the generic quality, which is that many people like me who are born very early in the period of decolonization, of independence, of post-colonialism, start journeys like this and end up in all kinds of places, usually in Western Europe or in the US, sometimes in Australia, etc., but mostly in Europe or in the US. So in a way, there is a lot of generic features. But what is interesting is that there is still some strange differences in the outcome of what happens, of what do we get interested in. So I would say that, people of my generation from India, if you take the big picture of savoir and circulation and so on, the bulk of the people go into the sciences. They're not even in our map. They go into engineering, medicine, this, that's it, physics, biology, chemistry. So we must remember that's 95 out of 100. Then there are 5 people left from that time, one of whom is called Homi Bhabha, one of whom is called Akhil Bilgrami, one of whom is called me. It's a tiny group that goes a slightly different way. And then there are others who are a bit younger than me, Shashi Tharoor, this one, Amitav Ghosh, the list goes on. And it looks very big, but if you think of India's population, it's very small compared to the people who go into the sciences, engineering, and other, technical fields. So it's a little bit like as if, the number of Normalians in France per 100 were 2, and everybody else was in the technical fields. That's not true in France, but in India, that's roughly the number. So therefore, we are all in a slightly special, small group. And it's interesting that many people in that general generation of people who are close to 70 one way or the other ended up, who were not in the sciences, ended up in that part of social science and humanities where there's a dialogue between anthropology, history, political science, literary studies, cultural studies. So you think, say of my galaxy of great friends whom I'm very proud of knowing, Dipesh Chakrabarti, Homi Bhabha, Gayatri Spivak. I mean, it's a star cast, and they're not just local figures, of course. But I, in that group, still have little more attachment to social science and so on. Hence, I'm very happy to be now Max Weber professor. So I have a little more sociology and, interest in social formations, organizations, power, etc., outside of what we can learn from the written word. So that's a small difference inside. And I think, I have no idea why it happened, but maybe because, in my generation, if you didn't become a doctor or engineer, the next idea was become an economist at least. So these are probably some kind of economics envy, It's like saying, okay, I can't do economics, I don't like mathematics, so let me do, some kind of vaguely empirical thing. And so I remain a little bit that way, different a bit, I think, than some of my peers from India who are, very active in post-colonial studies. So again, not a very specific answer, but I hope it offers some light on what you're saying.
Thank you very much. And by the way, I really loved this article particularly.
Okay, great.
Arjun, I would like to ask you a question that departs a little bit from an intervention that you gave as part of the public programming of the Kochi biannual educational program recently. It was part of a series of interventions, among them, some of your colleagues that you've mentioned, Bonaventure and Dikong and Dilip Menon. And in that contribution, you made a very interesting distinction between something that one could call the contradictory position of artists from what you've described broadly as the global South. And you were saying, or you said in this short talk, that on the one hand, they are burdened with what you would call the anxiety of tradition. That is to say, this sort of felt, or actually often a real necessity to relate to particular traditions of a very local context. And yet at the same time, exactly those same global South artists are becoming increasingly canonized as part of a globalized sphere that is precisely referred to as the global South. And so that's a very strange and interesting contradiction between localization and universalism. But before we get into that, I actually wanted to ask you a question about that with recourse to a very concrete context to bring some of these thoughts precisely into locations. And that is with recourse to a very concrete biographical movement of objects, namely your books, and in fact, a very large part of your library, to an institution that is here in Berlin, Savi Contemporary. And what's interesting about that move, to take that as an example to think with, is that on the one hand, it's a move of a large section of books that are dealing with modernity, but also counter-hegemonical and counter-canonical thought. And at the same time, of course, it is in some ways also a kind of canonization of your thought, of your person, of your library in a counter-hegemonical space. And so I wanted you to reflect on this contradictory position of the global South artist in relationship to this move of your books and your library that we're very curious to look at some point too when we can.
Well, thanks so much, Jonas, for that beautiful two-headed question, but the two heads do belong together. They're not exactly like Benjamin's angel, facing opposite directions, but there's some tension there. So I'll just say a word on the lecture Kochi, to say that the mediation of that paradox is the fact that is something else which needs investigation, which I just touched on, which is that if you're an artist from the global South, you have to somehow speak in the language of theory to be heard. Or somebody has to speak for you in that language. If you don't enter some kind of theoretical, abstract, conceptual, epistemological space and just say, but this is what I do, it's quite hard to become visible at the high end. And that is the mediation between the trap or anxiety or burden of tradition, where if you're, Chinese, then you must somehow flag that. But you must also speak somehow a language which might be called theoretical language. Whereas you can be, I think today, even in Berlin or Paris, but definitely in New York and so on, just a naive person who produces art, you don't have to have you don't have to have the painted word, as Tom Wolfe said, embedding your art in order to be seen and recognized. But if you're from Kerala or Delhi or something, you better be like Vivan Sundaram or Geeta Kapoor or any one of all people I admire greatly. But you have to be simultaneously an abstract thinker as well as an active producer. So that's, I think, the link between the trap and the global possibility is you have to somehow be in the space of some kind of theoretical discourse, either your own or somebody who interprets you or something like that. So that's my thought on the more general thing. But in the case of Savvy, where I'm so delighted, honored, thrilled to have this collection, which is both my own and also my late wife, Carol Breckenridge, contributed a lot of her interest to that collection. We shared many interests. So it's a very eclectic collection, but it is a kind of archive of my own movement. So it's a kind of a still photograph of the movie. So you can see the movie. If you just look at the photos in some way, you can tell here, he was reading Max Weber, Protestant Ethic, with Louis Koser in 1967 at Brandeis, Louis Koser already being a Zimmelian who was part of the exile from Hitler and ended up at Brandeis. So there's even that single book, my original copy of the Protestant Ethic, has a whole story there, but not that everybody needs to know it or has to know it, but you can see the books as telling that some version, some story in their adjacency, in their sequence, but in any sequence. So it doesn't have to be done that way, it can be done some other way. So what excited me is the thought that I could have a home for those books in Berlin that was consistent with the fact that I'm not a full-time employee or a civil servant now in any university, including Humboldt, where I still have a very good connection. But still, it's not in that full employed, professor category. This also reminds me, by the way, just a small correction to Marcus. My professorship is not at Bard Berlin, though I'm very thrilled to know people at Bard Berlin, but at something called the Bard Graduate Center, which is devoted to material culture studies and is in New York. So actually, it's a funny thing because I'm here, Bard Berlin is here, but my appointment is from there. It's another one of these strange facts, but they're all part of one Bard family, but the actual unit that's hosting me is this very unique unit in New York, which I'm happy to say more about if anyone wishes. But going back to your question, I will say just one more thing about the Savvy, the generosity, hospitality, warmth that Savvy has shown about this, which I see as a favor to me rather than the reverse, is that it speaks to something I am very interested in, which is not unconnected, I think, to the issue of universals and universalisms of different kinds. And that is something I wrote about in the book, Future as Cultural Fact, but it's an old interest which I have returned to now, which is the idea of research as a kind of very odd, modern, Western category, which we hardly discuss, ever. So somebody recently pointed out to me that in the Library of Congress in Washington, where there are millions of books, there are 2 that talk about research in a historical way. Knowledge, yes. Education, yes. But if you actually put in the R word, there's very little. And that was my own experience. So what interests me is opening up the site's sources, motives, and potentials of the pursuit of new knowledge, which is what research is, beyond its current location in a very tightly regulated sphere of credentialed higher education, and that to the highest part of higher education. So community colleges, vocational schools, gymnasia are not seen as a place of research. It's the high end. And I have long been driven by the idea that that shouldn't be so. And SABI for me is a great site for practicing, in a way, research in a milieu which is not primarily about degrees, education. In other words, the university. It's not the university. Of course, it's also not a museum, nor is it an exhibition. It's something of its own. But a lot is done there, which is about inquiry in new ways about new things. Well, that's research. That's going on. So I'm thrilled because my books there now can be one of the many things that feed in to that type of site, which interests me very much in terms of this problem of research. And I have a chapter in the Futures Cultural Fact called The Right to Research, which is not, I won't say still, sorry, has returned to becoming a kind of governing obsession for me. How do we open this to more people beyond its current locations? So that's a very indirect way to say what I enjoy or appreciate about the SABI connection. There are many other reasons, of course, which you are highly familiar with, but this is a more personal or idiosyncratic reason why it pleases me a great deal that these books are there.
Okay. In your reaction, Jonas, you did insist on the material culture and also the material culture of research work and the positioning in research work. Where are we based and how can we open up? This is, for me, a point I want to underline in your reaction, and allow me now to take Jonas' line of thinking a step further into the realm of objects and museums I'm working on, as I told you at the beginning of our conversation, and so also into the field of architecture and cities, which are widely interconnected. In some ways, we can think of museums as a kind of immobilisers, as spaces in which objects are stored, protected, put in constellations, and becoming kind of storytelling instruments in a way. And yet museums are also testaments to flows and biographies, to movements, to arrivals and departure. I would like to ask you a question about museums as spaces to think precisely about the relation between immobilization and mobility, especially against the background of more recent debates on the necessity of the restitution of colonial loot. You have made arguments about the contradictory nature in which we treat migrants or general human forced to delocate as movements to be regulated and stopped, while we are happy to contain non-European objects in European national collections or in the Encyclopedic Universal Museum, unwilling to allow them to move back to their places of origin, to move back or to circulate. Would speak about both possibilities. How would you characterize the role of museums today and in this debate, not just as regulators of flows of objects, but perhaps as think spaces precisely for the forces that structure our present, as anchors to think about flow and movement, but also immobility and grounding?
Thanks a lot. A very important and very difficult question for all the reasons that you have alluded to in formulating your question. this is an area where we are surrounded by a lot of fairly clear answers. In a way, we can say this is the problem, that is the problem. So if you look at the recent very heated debate about the renewed heated debate about Humboldt Forum, you can see the complaints are well known. The people who are on either side are also well known. In a way, it seems like what more is there to say? These things came out of a very nasty experience. Now we need to undo that, whether by repatriation, apology, restitution, something else. So it seems like there's not much more to say unless one has a very strange position, which is, so who cares, where they came from. They are for us and we enjoy some kind of very ridiculous position like that, which I don't want to waste time on. But if we are on generally the same side, what do we say about these institutions? And I have been thinking quite hard again about this. I've been in dialogue, not only with, of course, our friends at Savvy, but also people like Achille Mbembe and Fervent and so on about their view. And I do have a couple of thoughts, but the main one is this, that it's true that museums, by their nature, are like still photography in relation to cinema. You cannot go to an exhibition of photographs and say, well, why is it not moving? Well, it's not moving because it's not a movie. It's not cinema, But if you look at someone, say like Deleuze on the image, you'll see that there is some way we can think conceptually about images which are in photographs, but then they move, and then there's a grammar, and there's a way they move. It's not an impossibly different issue, but in museums, because they are not just, if you like, images, but primary objects, which are in their three-dimensional form, there is a sense of the immobility which is hard to defeat, even if you have other forms of reading and narration which are mobile. So there is a tension that's hard to meet. But I think the issue, and secondly, one of the best answers, which I support a lot, is what is called provenience research. Tell the story of how the object came. A lot of people are saying this now, and I say, great, good idea. But I don't think it's the answer to everything in these ethical and political and cultural dilemmas. You can't just say, well, here's the provenience. Now, everything else can remain undisturbed. We just tell a little more about provenience. Now we're happy. Well, I think the real question is, can museums, as it were, be organized around circulatory processes? Not admit them and then have the same everything the rest, but rather to say, build them around circulation. So build them around flows, build them around connections, exchanges, movements, not have that as a footnote that something came from somewhere and then we still tell the story, it means this, it means that. How about we change the whole priority and say the only meaning is the flow, circulation, exchange, arrival, departure, destinations, timetables. That's the only story worth telling. The rest is the footnote, that when it stops for 2 minutes, we can tell a story about Fiji, or we can tell a story about Apaches, or we can tell a story about something. That's the footnote, and we've mistaken the footnote for the page. So that would be one direction, where to go more radical than just provenience, to make flow, circulation, exchange, mobility of what's in the museum central to the exhibits, to the collections, to the curation, and so on. The other slight challenge in the current discussion, particularly about Europe and Africa, in France, but also in Germany and elsewhere, is if you say that there's got to be some form of repatriation, restitution, return, the trouble is both the person who does the restitution, the person who accepts it, are not the people involved originally. It's not the nation state. It's not Angela Merkel. It's a kingdom, it's a monarchy, it's this, it's that. In Africa, it's all kinds of other formations. So who suddenly made the government of Senegal, the right recipient? I mean, it's a recent product of all kinds of histories. Everybody knows this. So how can you have a return to a formation which is totally new? Now, you could say it should go back to Africa. That's, to me, more meaningful. But to say you should send it to Senegal or you should send it to Nigeria, my feeling is this is a category error with all sorts of ethical implications, just as, the Humboldt Forum speaking for, I don't know, for Germany, for Prussia, and so on, is also a bit strange because, as we were recently reminded, the German monarchy was directly related to Prince Philip. I mean, where's the German part here? I mean, it's already been exported 4 times over. So the question of the address of the sender and the address of the receiver both have changed. So how do we deal with that for repatriation? I don't have an answer to this, but one answer would be keep museums or urge museums to focus on circulation. Then this embarrassment doesn't happen, that the sender and the receiver are 2 completely different parties than the people who did the original transaction that moved the object, which has now got to be disguised, and somebody, Angela Merkel, has to speak on behalf of some, 18th century monarch or royalty or nobleman here, or 19th century. It's all very awkward. So anyway, again, these are some loose reactions to your wonderful and complex question.
Just a short remark, if I may, or a commentary, and it's a little bit to think about which place or connection for a building like the planned Museum for West African Art in Benin City, and how to think, to articulate the relation to the Nigerian National Museum in Lagos, and both to the Humboldt Forum in Benin or London, where Benin processes are found, and to think in that kind of nets of fixations in a network thing, and how to organize flows in between such circulation spaces. And here we come perhaps with Rem Koolhaas, who had a parallel, he thought in parallel storage of data and the storage of objects. And how can we use these new technologies and digital technologies in another way to rethink exhibition and the flow of objects. And so also the museum and its architecture.
So I can only say very quickly, these are very dynamic ideas, but there are 2 things I would say. One is I do believe in co-curatorship, or what used to be in the old days traveling exhibitions, but more than traveling exhibitions, even collaborative curation from multiple locations. There are lots of ways to free up. So we might say jokingly that in capitalism, financial capital has become completely fluid. But in the art world and exhibition world, it's still very fixed. It's like industrial capitalism. It's my factory, I made this, it's here. Finance capital is now wholly abstracted, goes everywhere, as we know. So maybe the art world can learn something about that. But I do have some hesitations about the Rem Koolhaas digitization. There are advantages to that. I mean, Google is doing some of this with art collections. It's not a bad thing, but I do think there is something a little bit like seeing movies in theaters. There's something about that sacramental experience which is removed. Once things start moving and you don't have to go to Paris or you don't have to go to Benin, you can be anywhere. In fact, you can actually be driving and open your iPhone, and I can't help believing that somewhere something is lost. And maybe the thing that is lost is that thing which my friend Tom Mitchell was trying to explore when he asked, what does the picture want? What does the image want? That desire of the thing itself is very hard to maintain when things become fully datafied, So that is my little worry, that we should keep these physical things but maybe introduce motion into them and not go to the temptation of abstracting them into the digital sphere. And then other problems will arise, in my view. So again, a wonderful question, and I'm just speculating along with you about how to think about it.
So I would like to put the focus on the issue of cosmopolitanism, which you also address in your book, The Future as Cultural Fact. By giving the example of the everyday life of the urban poor in Mumbai, you describe the emergence of a cosmopolitanism from below, which you define as follows. This vernacular cosmopolitanism also resists the boundaries of class, neighborhood, and mother town, but it does so without an abstract valuation of the idea of humanity or of the world as a generally known or knowable place. So my question is the following. How can the rethinking of the cosmopolitan, often associated with the universalism of the Enlightenment, as a micro-cosmopolitanism, a cosmopolitanism from below, help us to reconceptualize universality, starting from the local, out of concrete settings?
Yeah, thank you. Really a wonderful and very serious issue, because it invites us to make some distinctions which we often forget. One is, well, between cosmopolitanism, universalism, and also globalism, internationalism. These all have some family resemblances, as we would say, thinking of Wittgenstein, but they are not the same thing. Not only they are not the same thing, their individual meanings also need to be rethought a bit. So let's just take one pair, which is cosmopolitanism and universalism. And I think one way to look at cosmopolitanism from below, or generated by the poor, or by other people who are not in the business of Bildung, that. So the Bildung idea has to do with, let's say, the expanding of a self through experience whose cultural confidence is already set. So if somebody goes from England to Europe as part of their character building journey, it's not to question what is universal. It is just to, look around a bit from a confident position. So that is the type of universalism that I think we need to be a little careful about or suspicious of. That is the universalism which sees itself as already well-formed, already established, already relatively perfect. And therefore, as the consequence of that view, which can, also be held in a very open, gentle way, can be something very harsh, which is that its significance is only forceful export, namely imperialism. So I've argued in some of my own written work that the trouble with the, let's say, classical modern European idea of universalism is that it requires the whole world in order for it to retain its confidence. So for me to believe that my views are universal, everybody has to be more or less believe what I believe, and that may require me to change them, to convert them, to do this, to that, civilizing process, or much more brutal versions of that. But basically, the world has to sign on. So that is the universalism I'm not much in support of. The question is there any other kind? In other words, can you have any view of humanity, human life, of what is valued and valuable without having that impulse? And my feeling is yes, because that urge to say my universalism only makes sense if everybody signs on. That is, it is literally empirically universal. Everybody believes it, therefore X or Y. Also requires a whole series of things that I think are special in Western history. commerce, mapping, navigation, conquest, all those things in a short form, which we can call the long or short history of capitalism. If you don't have that, 800-pound gorilla just waiting off stage, then you can be quite universalist and not require, other people to die for your universalism. You could just say, all people are like this or like that, let's be nice to it. But not if you don't, I'm going to come there, take your land away, exploit you, and then reform you, teach you, and convert you until you agree with what I think. And when you agree, you will become so much like me that I will have to leave you. And of course, when I leave you, that's decolonization, right? Because the black and brown people say, you say we are like you. Yes, we are like you. We also like freedom. So fuck off, go home. So the supreme sacrifice of the European West is to say, we agree, your argument is right. Now, of course, this is not the Oxford Debating Society. There's a lot of other factors involved. They're not just giving in to arguments, but there is an argument part to it. But that process, which is a bloody process over 400 years, 500 years, depending where you're talking, is not the requirement of every universalism. After all we have to do, and I'll just take this one example, is look at the work of, say, Descola, or any one of the wonderful scholars who work on the Amazon and on the place of humans and non-humans in a shared cosmology, of which we have Viverosa Castro and so many other people. They, these small groups in the Amazon, so far as I can tell, although this is not investigated as closely as it should be, don't seem to want everybody, even in their own area, to believe what they believe in order to believe in it fully. They inhabit it, they live it, but they don't seem to say, if we don't spread it through the whole of the Amazon, the whole of Latin America, and in fact, the whole of the world, it's not meaningful. They don't seem to think that way, feel that way, okay. So it's an idea of cosmos, to come back full circle, which is not actually about globalization, where you have to move the idea everywhere and test it, check it, convert, etc. It's a different, short journey to the cosmos. In someone like Mary Douglas's idiom, it's from my body straight up to the cosmos. Doesn't require a flat stage where I go country by country, body by body, convert, persuade, beat, torture, till all the bodies are lined up. So again, a very long, indirect, wandering answer, but I think what I'm trying to identify is where the flaw is in a certain kind of universalism, where it can be avoided in some other kind of universalism. That's why I like the idea of minor or other or alternative universalism, because otherwise we have only one choice, yes or no. Do you like it or you not like it? It's the kind of thing I hate intellectually. That's it. All I'm allowed is one vote, yes or no. That is not so much. Anyway, I stop there. I don't know if this makes any sense at all, but
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
Most welcome.
I would like to ask you a question that concerns research practices in cosmopolitan contexts, such as India, where there are diverse cultures and languages, or in fact, on a much smaller scale, an international festival which gathers people from diverse backgrounds and domains in a concrete local context. This field raises important methodological questions, not least for the research I conduct myself. Concretely, you have suggested one way of responding to this complexity with your proposal of documentation as intervention, which you developed with your colleague Raul Srivastava at PUCA, a non-governmental organization that you co-founded. My question to you, therefore, how do we as researchers cope with such ambient polyphony in our research? What is the scope or limit of researchers' imagination in describing or narrating their fields? Thank you.
Well, that's a great question. I particularly appreciate that you know something about my ongoing investment in my hometown in Bombay, a small place about 5 times bigger than Berlin, as you know, more like Lagos, but bigger than Berlin. So Pukar is something that I am not directly involved with anymore because it's been a long time, but the idea is something very precious to me and connected to this idea of the right to research, etc. So as you recognize, and documentation as intervention was, I must say, one of the most early flashes of a phrase that I had, which I've always been very proud of, because it's not only has some possibilities, but it's like a good slogan or branding. And I've always been good at that, titles, branding, etc. Not so much on the substance, which more serious thinkers do, but I always am good on the little package. So the little package, documentation, intervention, still is very helpful to me. And I still find it generative and useful. So the question of polyphony, multiple languages, etc., which of course is also true in many parts of the world now, certainly in Africa, certainly in the Caribbean, certainly in Latin America, but in India it's blatant, meaning so many different languages, even different language families between the South and the North. It's in your face, but in other places it may not be. You have to look a little more closely, and then you see that in Johannesburg there are people speaking 15 languages, in one neighborhood. So it's not only India, but it's everywhere. So my thought is there is one level at which we can do what many people do, which is to try to be open to plurality, diversity of expression, of style, of this and that. The next level is openness to disciplinary differences between this approach, that approach. Institutional approaches, if you're a museum, if you're an art collective, if you're a housing society, etc. So this gets more and more tricky as you change the meaning of polyphony to all these different kind of polyphonies. But what I would still say is that these ideas remain deeply relevant to me because I'm also very interested in thinking critically about, let's say, diversity, which is a term we all use. We use it positively, but what does it really mean to encourage diversity? I mean, for what, for whom, in what way interests me a lot. And the question of documentation, the fact that it produces a disturbance in your environment, there's the intervention part. For me, is intimately connected to the idea of research as something that anyone should be able to do, that is any citizen. And in Pukar, we tried that with considerable success. And my dear, still close friend, Rahul Srivastav, whom you mentioned, also had something he called the neighborhood project, where when he was teaching students at a small college in Bombay, he would tell them, write me an essay about your street on which you live, or your father's restaurant. Where did he come to Bombay from? In other words, instead of teaching Zimmel and some big abstract urban sociology, he said, tell your story and I will tell you how it might fit. So he had a whole strategy, which also led us to the idea of documentation, because they wrote, and then he collected these essays, circulated them among. There was a whole concrete pedagogy, which was extremely rich for me. And what it reminds me of, which speaks to your question, is how there can be a mutual flow between university structures, such as what we are in now, whether in Berlin or anywhere else, or in Germany or in Africa or in India. The university is a certain kind of thing. And then there are other places, museums, exhibitions, Savvy, etc., who are doing research their own way. By the way, so is the army, so is the church. So it's not all nice stuff, everybody's doing research. So my thinking on this subject recently was greatly advanced, because I was always thinking, well, let's say you teach people, ordinary young people in the city who don't have BAs or even high school degrees, how to, let's say, take photographs or how to do an interview. This can be done, and we have done it in India, in Bombay. But how, then if you ask, not only how is it good for them to learn these techniques, but how does it help us? Is there a two-way process, or is it again a missionary process where we are teaching them how to do this, how to do that, how to do some statistics, and we are still the experts and they are learning? This second question is much more difficult. Like, how does it help, Humboldt or Witz, to do something if they do this or if they take part in this? And the answer came out in a brilliant insight from my dear friend Ashil Mbembe in a recent conversation, where he reminded me that in a place like Witwatersrand University, his university, the struggles of ordinary citizens are already there in the students. The students are often not living in good housing. They are separated from their families. They are poor. They are oppressed by the police. So it's not like they are inside and then somebody is outside. They are the somebody and they are inside already. So what the revolutionary insight for me, and this is about 2 weeks old now, it's very recent, is at least in some places, maybe not in Geneva or Paris, but maybe there too, the outside is already inside. People are already struggling. They're already, in other words, they're also citizens facing all the struggles of citizens. They're not just students wearing a special costume, So the mix is already there. So then the question becomes, how do we teach or train or expose our own students who may be from all kinds of backgrounds, polyphonic, how to do this in a way that reminds them that they're also citizens. And there are other citizens who don't even have the chance to think about this. But it's all continuous. It's not we are the students living in heaven, and then there are some citizens who we need to teach how to do research. And now this is self-criticism, because as an academic, from day one, I still have a hard time breaking out of that idea that we should not monopolize something, we should distribute it, etc. But I never realized that the university is already full of the world of society. And therefore, in redoing our curricula and all, we are both changing ourselves, but we are changing the world because the world is inside. So something like this is my direction of thinking. And I notice now we may be running a bit short, Jonas and Marco. So for which I take full responsibility because I have taken a lot of time with my responses. But thank you for this question, which I appreciate.
Thank you, Arjun. As you say, time is running out a bit, so please allow me to ask you a last question, which tries, to pick up a notion that you mentioned, which is intervention, and also, to build a community of citizens within university and outside, and how to combine it, which also is in line with what Clément asked you. And I would like to pick up one notion that you made very strong in the future as a cultural fact, which is hope, which has a lot to do with that. And I would like to ask you a question that concerns a bit, that goes back to the beginning, because it concerns a bit, your parcours, and also how that is linked in a way to our understanding of the world. Because when I read your oeuvre, I think that there is a very great hope in your analysis of globalization, that there is something like a transnational character coming up. So in our terms, we could say maybe that within all of these analyses of flows and life forms that get interconnected, there is something like a shared humanity showing up.
Sure.
And you worked on that a lot. And so recently I read your highly interesting article on the democratic fatigue, which was published in this wonderful project, which is called The Great Regression, and which deals with exactly the contrary. I mean, with the coming back of the nation, the closing of societies, all of these right-wing movements coming back, cultural relativism in a very racial sense also.
Yes.
So let's say that was not very optimistic, and in a way it was, sort of a depriving answer also to what you have been working so many years through, to show that globalization has also this, let's say, cosmopolitan or universal aspect. So my question would be, and I go back to a work which I really like, The Future as a Cultural Fact, because there you not only develop a concept like hope or cosmopolitanism from below, but also you show how much these ideas are depending on our own epistemology and scientific praxis. And you suggest a partisan position, which you call like that. I like that very much. So you say that would mean to become, and I quote, mediators, facilitators, and promoters of the ethics of possibility against the ethics of probability. So now, set against, you know, the democratic fatigue, all of these, I mean, counter movements, and also maybe against the background of the global pandemic. And we started with that, with the, you know, really disastrous events, especially in India, but in some parts of the world now, and which maybe we have to read as a crisis of also global solidarity, of our planetary existence in a way. How do we revisit your proposal to reorient, let's say, the humanities or the social sciences or the whole field of these disciplines concerned with globalization and with human life in a way, towards the future, and let's say a collective capacity to aspire, as you say?
Yes. Well, thanks very much, Marcus. Certainly a very important and suggestive and generous question from your side, also which affects or inflects retrospectively many things I've been saying today, but also things I've written over time, all of which have a certain tension. You know, when I wrote Modernity at Large in 1996 or published it, a lot of people afterwards said, oh, this guy is just, you know, very happy about globalization. He thinks the world is wonderful. Well, I think there's a lot of material in the book that shows that I don't think the world is so wonderful, but it may have been perhaps too hopeful. So then I swung a little bit the other way with fear of small numbers, and after the attack on the Twin Towers and various other things, to say, you know, the world has gone in all sorts of very troubling directions. Now, of course, I still struggle with the question of, in such dark times, you know, how do we think favorably and positively with ideas like universalism or empathy or other, or hope. And I have two thoughts on it. One is more something which I say as a kind of aphorism or epigram, which is that, you know, when I worked with these very poor people in Mumbai in around the year 2000 for several years, and I still am in touch with them, these are people, some of whom live on the pavement, are waiting 20 years to get a small, humble flat somewhere. And these are literally families on the sidewalk who have lived in the sidewalk for long. So there are many examples like this, and these were the organizers and the movers and the activists that I was looking at, who are right at the ground level, not mediators themselves, right at the ground level. And my question to people who said, how can you be hopeful in the face of A, B, C, D, is, if these people can be hopeful, how do I have the right to be hopeless? So that's still my view, that even if I don't have the intellectual foundation, I cannot give up the position that there has to be hope, because these people are hopeful. And if they can be, who am I sitting in Berlin to say, oh, you know, things are too dark, we must just give up and shoot ourselves in the head or commit collective suicide? It's a supreme act of arrogance. So for me, in a kind of, how to put it, axiomatic way, I can't be hopeless because of this argument. Now, then the question is, but what about the details? I mean, how can you be hopeful because of this, because of that? And here, Jonas may have heard a recent talk that I gave at Humboldt, where I brought back one of my heroes, who's Ernst Bloch. So I'm reading again Bloch very carefully, and I'm really thinking hard about the idea of the not yet. Because of course, he's, for me, the biggest thinker on hope, serious thinker of our century. That is the last century, the last 150 years on this topic. I mean, I still have to find anybody who has that level of interest and depth, and who, above all, wanted to say to us, wanted to prevent us or stop us from thinking of utopia as the place where everything stops and things are fine, things are perfect. So the city on the hill, or whatever, heaven on earth, that these are all the things which come up also in very subtle visions, which for him are wrong. So what was his answer? The not yet. So the not yet was, and I'm still trying to understand fully, and I'm not a German reader, so I have to work in translation and guess and infer, but I'm thinking that he's pointing to something uncrystallized and emergent, which is therefore a possibility, but which is produced in the midst of ordinary life, in all kinds of ordinary settings, not only high political settings or theological settings, but ordinary practices of entertainment, of religion, of solidarity, and so on, in which something emerges which has the possibility of moving us forward. But what I'm taking away from Bloch is that it's not a matter of examining those moments and picking the winners and saying, well, this one is going to bring us to perfection. The others were just mistakes. It's the very emergence. That's where hope lives. So I'm trying to learn this idea of his more thoughtfully, to, in other words, see that it's in that constant emergence of partially crystallized possibilities that we must dwell and place our politics. So when you come to say something like universalism, I think the temptation to avoid is to wait till everything is still and it's in place. I think the impulse has to be treasured. The actions which exemplified, and I don't know, I think Jonas was present at the talk. I'm struggling now, and this brings me right into my present of the last few weeks, with an idea which I'm calling traces of the future. That is, what are the things that leave small marks of the future? That is literally, which are in some kind of archive that we can encounter as historians or as ethnographers. I'm seeing many things, but there's something which I think is a trace, but it's not a trace of the past or the present. It's a trace of the future. So I'm trying to unpack this paradox, hoping that it's a paradox which is productive to unpack and not just a mistake of language or mistake of expression. But that's what Bloch is helping me with, is thinking that the not yet leaves, in fact, traces of the future, and we must resist the temptation, either looking ahead or looking retrospectively, to say this one was a winner. It actually worked. That one was a loser because it turned bad, etc. It's not about that. It's about potentiality, therefore possibility. Again, I've kind of wandered into some very indirect reflection, but it does connect, I think, your question to my current struggles with, in fact, where are the resources for hope in a world where there are so many reasons to give up or to be radically pessimistic? To me, it's this little constant appearance of the uncrystallized, plausible, but also concrete. Actually, you can put your finger on it. You can see someone saying something or doing something which is Bloch's not yet, and you can do something with it. So maybe on that note, Marcos and Jonas and all of you, I will say goodbye for now, and thank you for such a generous and serious and hospitable discussion.
Thank you so much. Is all of us who thank you very, very cordially, and for your generosity, the time you took, and also your wonderful last answer that copes so strongly and comes so close to many of the ways we wander around the same kind of search and endeavor. And I think are wonderful words for
I wish you all actually very good luck with this terrific project, and this conversation, shows me actually the rightness of my intuition, that this was a wonderful chance for me to talk to people who are in many ways exploring or thinking about similar things. So the dialogue will continue, I'm sure. But for now, I go on to my next little obligation. Thank you all. Thanks, Jonas. And we will see each other again.